Welcome to Open BxRx Tuesday on BronxNet. I'm your host, Kibin Alleyne, and I'd like to invite you to get social with us at BronxNet TV on Instagram and Twitter, and BronxNet Community Television on Facebook. Conversations on gun violence have resurfaced after the mass shooting at Uvalde Elementary School in Texas. Joining me to discuss the phenomenon of mass shootings and a common denominator in many cases is Jacqueline Schildkraut, an associate professor of criminal justice for SUNY Oswego. Jacqueline, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me today.
Now, a year ago, you wrote an article about mass shootings and as society returns to normal after the COVID-19 pandemic, what does the future of mass shootings look like? Can you tell me your thoughts on this now?
Yeah, it kind of was a sad reality. I think, I remember when we first entered into the pandemic that March, and everyone's like, "This is the first, March that we haven't had a school shooting." And in my mind, I was going, "Well, no one's at school." And so when we saw in, March and April of 2021 that there was, we had events like Boulder and the FedEx shooting in Indianapolis. When I was talking with reporters around that time, they said, "Well, should we be expecting this?" And the thing is mass shootings didn't necessarily go away during the pandemic. The opportunity for them to happen in public spaces went away, and so, or it kind of shifted. And so, as society came back out and we started to resume our normal activities, it was something that we saw, start to pick back up again in these more public spaces. A colleague and I actually have another article that's getting ready to come out, and we took data from the Gun Violence Archive with their mass shootings, which is a bit more broader of a definition than I normally use. But we looked at sort of how the frequency of mass shootings changed with the pandemic. And what we ended up finding is that they didn't only increase in public spaces, but also private spaces. And so, even though it wasn't necessarily happening in places like schools and businesses or workplaces by current or former employees, there's other public locations where these events were happening through the pandemic.
Now, just to help our viewers understand, can you just explain how a mass shooting is defined?
That depends on who you ask, Kevin. A lot of definitions are varied, and so that leads us to really having a lack of understanding in this country about how many. The definition that you see on the screen here is the definition my colleague and I crafted to look specifically at mass public shootings and trying to really account for some situational factors. So the Gun Violence Archive does a phenomenal job of capturing any event in which four or more people are killed, but there's definitely going to be differences in how we respond to sort of these premeditated public mass shootings that we're very used to hearing about, like Buffalo and Uvalde. And then also things that, just happen to erupt out of a fight. That leads to less opportunities per se for intervention, but other opportunities to prevent. So we really tried to focus in on sort of the context or those, situational factors that differentiate how the shootings can come to occur. And then I think another challenge to understanding the definition is that a lot of there's so much variability in how many people constitute the mass in mass shooting. A lot of people use the 4+ fatality requirement, so four or more people would have to die, whereas the Gun Violence Archive uses four or more shot, and we use an even more liberal definition. There's so many reasons why individuals who happen to find themselves in a mass shooting survive or don't survive. Things like how fast law enforcement responds, where they are shot, how fast they get medical treatment. So there's a lot of different factors that increase or affect survivability. And so we want to be really mindful of that and not just saying, well, enough people didn't die, this doesn't count as a mass shooting.
Now, can you tell us about the history of mass shootings in our country? Because sadly, this is not something new that we're seeing.
Yeah, so a lot of people really kind of think about Columbine as being the first, and it's first in its own right in certain ways. Columbine was really the first time that we ever saw mass shootings unfold live on television the way we're very used to seeing them today, and that actually just happened to be a matter of coincidence in terms of the news media on the national networks were not too far away covering a very different high-profile case when the information or the news broke about the shooting. But we've actually been able to trace mass shootings or mass public shootings all the way back into the 1800s. Of course, being able to do so is quite difficult because a lot of us rely on the media to help us identify those events. And obviously, the media in the 1800s wasn't what it is today.
Now, in your article, you focus on some trends associated with mass shootings. Can you explain what you found?
Yeah, so a couple of things that are really important to note. Most mass shooters obviously are, using actually, all mass shooters are using a firearm, because that's the requisite for it to be a shooting versus some other type of mass casualty event. The majority of shooters rather are males who work alone. On average, the mass shooter, looking at sort of all instances, is about 33 years old, and we do know that these types of incidents are most likely to happen in schools and workplaces. And that is because these shootings are typically perpetrated by people who are familiar with the location. So it could be a current or former student or a current or former employee. So it's largely a function of opportunity when they're selecting their sites.
Now, you mentioned that the common denominator in these mass shootings is the fact that the perpetrators are usually male. Was this something that you've noticed before, or is this kind of more of a recent finding?
No, it's actually pretty much always been like that. I remember back, and I believe it was about 2015 or 2016 when there was the shooting at the YouTube headquarters out in California. And it happened to be a female perpetrator, and everybody was incredibly confused. They're like, "Well, wait, does this happen?" And it's very, very rare that females will engage in mass shootings, especially as you can see here on their own, versus being paired with a male. But I think what we're seeing is something that largely mirrors our broader crime trends in America, which is that, when females offend in terms of homicide, they are far more likely to use things like poisoning or suffocation, asphyxiation than they are to pick up a firearm.
Now, why are we seeing this type of violence from males?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Again, I think it largely comes into the fact that males are more likely to commit these acts of violent crime and more likely to use a firearm, and so it's sort of that perfect storm or that convergence of factors that creates it. Certainly there are researchers out there who argue for toxic masculinity. There is some evidence that suggests that there is a domestic violence relationship between mass shooters, or in mass shooting cases. So, I think that there's a lot of different factors at play in terms of why it's seemingly a male perpetrated phenomenon.
Now, you kind of talked about the age a little bit. I think it's very alarming that we're seeing a lot of young males. Two of them were about 18 years old. Do you think there's a certain type of conditioning in our country that's inspiring these young males to kind of commit these acts?
There it that's a hard question to answer, but I think an important one to ask. Certainly we know that there are a lot of males in our society who are young males who are suffering from mental health crises, who play violent video games, who express interest in firearms, and would never go on to do something of this nature. I think a challenge is in many instances you have these individuals who are craving attention in some way, and when you have a very high profile event like Columbine, like Sandy Hook, now like Uvalde, where individuals have effectively gone from nobody to celebrity in terms of how much media coverage they're getting, it certainly says to an individual who, may be like minded that, hey, if you go out and do this, you'll also get this kind of attention.
So you brought up video games, which I think is a really interesting point because a lot of people have always thought video games, violent movies, but I wonder, about social media. Do you think social media could play a part, and especially since we're seeing a lot of, male empowerment type of movements online, do you think that's why we could be seeing this phenomenon?
It's difficult to say because there's not really, excuse me, there's not really any research to suggest that. I think a challenge is that social media didn't necessarily make this new. It made it more accessible and it made it more prevalent for us to be able to recognize it. And, certainly we see that, where in, past years, it might have been that perpetrators were vocally telling people that they were going to go out and commit these acts through their leakage, like person to person. Now they may have shifted those behaviors online. We also know, of course, the internet makes it very easy for them to study one another. So I don't necessarily know that social media has made it worse. It's certainly made it more obvious.
Now, what do you think could be done to address this issue? And I'd also like to know, do you feel like this is a gender problem or is it more of an issue of gun accessibility?
I think it's a perfect storm of factors. Certainly, if we didn't have guns or had better regulations on guns, it might help to prevent some, though not all, of these mass shootings. We also know that guns are the means, but they're not everything that lead up to it. And even if replaced, it could still lead to mass casualty events. For instance, on the same day that the Sandy Hook shooting happened back in 2012, December 14th, you actually had somebody who in China, where guns are illegal, take a very large knife into a school, go to a kindergarten class, so very similar in age in terms of the victims, and knife 22 children. And, certainly, there was most of those individuals, I believe all of those individuals survived their attack because of the difference of weapon, knife to firearm. But it shows that you can remove some means, but you can't remove them all.
Now, we have about 2 minutes left. In that same article, you state understanding this phenomenon in its unique context is necessary to distinguish strategies needed to prevent public mass shootings. Can you expand on this?
Yeah, I think we get too often really focused on one tree and we forget about the forest. And there's never going to be one main cause of why mass shootings happen. There's not one factor. So, for instance, here in New York, we had about a month ago the shooting in Buffalo, and everybody became very fixated on the fact that this individual was a white supremacist, where at the same time, there were white supremacists down at Disney who were waving Nazi flags at the entrance to the Magic Kingdom. Now, both of those are absolutely horrible, but they're very different outcomes. And so, if you are focused really narrowly on trying to identify the motive or a profile of these individuals, which doesn't exist, you miss the bigger picture, which is that while there may be variability between these individuals in terms of what they look like or what they're upset about or what their motivation is, they're all doing the exact same thing, and their behaviors from that grievance or that kind of motivation up to the shooting is very, very similar, which creates important opportunities for intervention.
All right, Jacqueline, thank you so much for joining me. Can you quickly just let everybody know how they can stay up to date with you and your work?
Absolutely. You are welcome to follow me on Twitter. It's at jschildkraut80. And I'm also on my website, www.jaclynschildkraut.com.
All right, once again, thank you so much for joining me. We'll be right back with more Open BxRx Tuesday.